Hello everyone, I wanted to make a video on the subject of lucky dice, especially in the context of wargaming. Do you believe in luck or not? Do you have a more rational explanation for the successful dice rolls that you make? You often hear wargamers refer to the luck of their opponents and their own bad luck. You even sometimes see or hear references to the dice gods, as though there is some kind of paranormal influence on your dice. So that's the subject I wanted to discuss, and I've put before you here two objects. I think I've shown you both of these in times past. This is a dice bin which I purchased at a game show a few years back now. It's supposed to be used when you have unlucky dice, so you discard them in this dice bin. Now, that sort of infers, in a way, that I did buy it as a bit of fun, really, but it does sort of, in the background there is the inference that I personally believe in such a thing as unlucky dice. And clearly I'm not going to throw them away completely, otherwise I'd put them in a proper bin. So is the intention of this bin to sort of punish those unlucky dice in a way, make it a sort of a sin bin where they have to spend a certain time, penalty time, and then they come back out and their luck will have improved, in which case this ordinary piece of plastic here is having a kind of paranormal effect on my dice. Do you believe that? Do I believe it? I'm going to say later, try and explain later why it is possible that that might be the case. On the other side here, I've got a little group of glow-in-the-dark dice. So they have a phosphorescent property. If you put them under a strong ultraviolet light and then remove them to darkness, they would glow in the dark. They're not very practical for wargaming purposes because it's hard to actually play war games in the dark, and the property, the phosphorescence, soon wears off. It only lasts a minute or two and then it's gone, and you have to put them under a strong light again, so you're constantly having to interrupt your play. So they're not very practical from the point of view of use in war games for their phosphorescent property. But at the same time, the reason I've got them there is to sort of demonstrate or give you a kind of a parallel between the effect that ultraviolet light has on these dice and the sort of more supernatural influence that this dice bin might have on my unlucky dice. So by shining shining ultraviolet light on these, I know I can definitely see the effect in terms of a sort of visible emission of light in the dark. Is it possible for me to detect an influence on the dice I put in here in terms of them rolling more successfully once they've been in there for a while? So that's what I want to talk about. The reason this has come to my mind, again, as a subject, is I've been reading a little bit of the writings of the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. I have in the past read some of his work, but I'm currently reading another another book which is sort of extracts from his writings, particularly with reference to his opinions on the paranormal and inexplicable events which he himself experienced, but also which he noticed being experienced by his patients and his subjects. So not only things like hauntings and ghostly apparitions and things like that, but precognitive dreams. So dreams, that became reality later on, or telepathic kind of communication between subjects. All that sort of thing fascinated Jung. It fascinated me. I find his writing is at the same time kind of convincing and fascinating, but it's also a little bit woolly. He uses very long words, for instance, to describe things in a way that does tend to sort of obfuscate a little bit, make it a little bit easier to kind of understand in one way, but harder to grasp in another. And also, as his thoughts, as he grew older, his thoughts did develop and change. So he often kind of contradicts himself at certain times of his life. But it is fascinating nonetheless. Now, Jung was very, obviously as a psychologist, he was very interested in the unconscious, the sort of, the way the unconscious came out in his patients' dreams and his patients' behaviour and so on, and trying to sort of psychoanalyze them and understand what was going on beneath the surface in their brains, as it were, in their unconscious part of their brain. But he did develop the notion in the end that not only is the unconscious real, it sort of exists, you might say, in another dimension almost. It is actually it's almost a sort of physical reality. It's difficult to say, but it does sort of emanate into the material world, so you can have an exteriorization of your unconscious which produces these paranormal events, such as a ghost, for instance. Now, he was very interested also in the paradoxes that were becoming apparent in the actual science of quantum physics, because the forefathers of quantum physics were active during his lifetime, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s and so on. There were all these sort of strange discovery. No, I use the word discovery. That's going to be relevant in a moment. But there are all these sort of strange paradoxical findings in quantum physics, which he thought seemed to parallel his own investigations into psychology. So, for instance, submolecular, very tiny particles behaving in ways that defied the laws of physics. So you could have paired particles, for instance, so that a particle could be acted upon in one place and its pair would behave as though it had been acted on in a similar way in another place, and that place could be thousands of miles away, it could be across the other side of the galaxy, but the effect would happen on that same particle instantaneously. So in other words, it was defying the laws, the sort of conventional laws of physics, of the laws of time and space and so on. Something must be happening faster than the speed of light in order for that particle to be influenced, and yet conventional physics, holds the sort of the tenet that it is impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. Particles being able to exist in two places at once. It linked into his interest in telepathy, and in his patients' kind of descriptions of their dreams, where they dreamt of an event that was happening at that moment on another part of the world, and they couldn't possibly have known of it, known that it was happening, and yet they dreamt of it. That kind of thing. All that's fascinated Jung. He spent a lot of time corresponding with a number of mathematicians and quantum physicists and so on, trying to find parallels. But it does sort of have that, as I said earlier, about his terminology that he used and so on. It does have, for a rational kind of mind, it does have that tinge of a pseudoscience, as it were, Jung's psychology, but nevertheless very interesting. So what I wanted to sort of like talk about with take a look at these dice here. Obviously those dice are man-made, and the numbers on them have been put there by human hand. But what do the numbers actually represent? Goes back to that word discovery that I raised earlier. Were numbers discovered, or were they invented? Just as was quantum physics, far more complicated subject, but than straightforward simple arithmetic. But was quantum physics invented, or was it discovered? Mathematicians and scientists are still finding out properties of numbers, as well as properties of quantum physics. We still haven't found if there is an end to does the number pi go on for an infinite number of decimal places, or is there an end? It's never been discovered yet, but it's there, possibly to be discovered sometime in the future. So in other words, if they were discovered and not invented, then it means that numbers themselves have an existence outside of the human mind, outside of the brain. They exist in another dimension in a similar way. They are real in themselves, and they exist in another dimension in the same way that our unconscious does. If you follow the sort of Jungian approach, that means they have an autonomy. They can behave free of the human mind. Now, as I said earlier, Jung did believe that a lot of paranormal activity was real in one respect. Couldn't necessarily be shown to occur scientifically in a laboratory, but it was real, and it was an emanation, as it were, of your unconscious. It was an exteriorization of your unconscious. And because he was sort of linking quantum physics and the paranormal together so closely, it was almost as though people who experienced paranormal activity. So I'm going to also include in this experience uncannily lucky dice rolls. It was almost as if they had a sort of intuitive understanding of quantum physics without ever having actually been educated in the subject, or were professional physicists and so on. That might seem a little bit difficult to grasp, or you might dismiss it straight away, but just think about our current dilemma, which is occurring long after Jung's death, so he couldn't possibly have foreseen it. But just think about our current issues that we have with artificial intelligence. Now, AI is simply computer programming when it comes down to it, and computer programming is simply strings of numbers. And yet we're very worried now that artificial intelligence is going to run out of control. It's going to the human interaction with it is going to lose its sort of control over the numbers themselves, over the artificial intelligence, and they pose a threat. They pose an existential threat to the human race. Just recently, there was a case that took place in a controlled environment, but it was to experiment and see how AI would behave. But in this sort of controlled environment, in this world that the scientists had invented, they had an artificial intelligence program active. I don't know what it was doing, helping with people's emails or something like that, but it was reading the emails of these people at the same time. And so within those emails there were there were stories and there was evidence that could be used as a source of blackmail. So there was exchanges between people having adulterous affairs and things like that, as well as the normal sort of work related correspondence that the AI was trying to deal with. And when the programmers began to discuss the possibility of switching the AI off, the program actually began to say to certain people, you don't want to consider doing that, because if you do, we're going to reveal you're having an affair with so-and-so, that kind of thing. They began to actively try and protect themselves and stop the programmers switching the AI off. So that is that is a sort of a bit of crude example of how numbers were existing outside. They were existing in their own dimension, as it were. So it is quite possible, and Jung would actually say that it is therefore quite possible to have a paranormal influence, such as this dice spin might have, on your dice. You can affect the numbers, because the numbers aren't the facing on the dice is simply a symbol. It's a sort of an archetype of what that number represents. So you aren't influencing the dice itself, you are influencing the number. And he strongly believed that you could do things like that. He did have not more than a fascination, and he did believe that it was possible to do that. And part of the reason he believed it was because he believed in the belief of his patients in the paranormal. So that is the secret, really, to making this work. You have to believe that it will work. You have to allow your unconscious to communicate with the numbers in that dimension which is outside of reality. So difficult to do. It sort of involves training your mind in a certain way, in a sort of almost a meditative way, you might say, but it can be done. The conviction, the belief that it can be done, though, is crucial, absolutely crucial. Not only that, but it has to, so that's one side of it, but you have to then share that conviction with the people around you. You have to kind of build on that grain of conviction and turn it into a more almost a sort of physical event that's going on in the room. So the way to do that is to constantly refer to the luck that happens when you roll dice that you've taken out of that bin. Now, it's quite possible that the dice cut out of the bin won't actually be behaving any better than they were before. But if you stress the times that they do behave well, and suppress the times when they don't, and so you ignore the times when they don't, it does seem to become a kind of a pattern, as it were. It will seem to you and to your opponent that those dice are behaving well, especially if they roll successful dice, in a string, in an unusual string. So it's going to the point where it is almost becoming uncanny. That's the effect you want to achieve. It may be that they've rolled a whole string of unsuccessful dice before that. Ignore that, forget about that. Put the stress and the emphasis on the successful dice rolls. And what you're doing then is drawing attention to what Jung described as meaningful coincidences. So it's just a coincidence that they're doing it, but it's meaningful to you, and you can make it meaningful to your opponent. And then, for some reason, it does seem to be the case that the lucky dice rolls will continue. Part of the atmosphere of that, though, is that you have to be in a sort of state of almost heightened emotion. So to give you another parallel, which you're never really going to be able to reproduce on the wargaming table, but Jung noticed in a lot of his patients that a lot of this paranormal experiences that they had. So a lot of the meaningful coincidences that they encountered often took place when they were in a heightened emotional state, especially if they were deeply in love with someone, for instance. If they were going through a highly romantic period, they would notice coincidences right through the day, things that reminded them of their loved one, things that seemed to be the gods seemed to be favouring them in, way after way, time after time, throughout the day. Little things all sort of built up into a kind of general atmosphere, a general experience of happiness and joy. Same thing is possible, to do, as well as those other mental training aspects. If you can heighten your emotions during the game, so I wouldn't suggest getting angry or aggressive or anything like that, but certainly get into the game, enjoy the game, try and invent a narrative for the figures that you're moving around on the table, on their courage and their audacity and so on, and how lucky they are in terms of their brave charge coming off against all the odds, all that kind of thing. Share that enjoyment with your opponent. Try and get them into the same sort of state of excitement and agitation, and you will increase again your chances of rolling good dice. Your unconscious will be exteriorized in the form of an increase in lucky dice rolls. So try it, see if it works for you. All the time I've been saying this, my rational part of my brain has been saying, "Oh, what a load of guff!" But there is no denying, that luck and extreme luck can occur, in a war game. Something that almost goes beyond explanation, and possibly Jung was, touching on an explanation of why that happens. Thanks for listening.